Welcome back, slave narrative lovers. We're still with Harriet Jacobs in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, 7 Years Concealed. So I've done some editing, so I'm doing chapter 8 and part of chapter 9. Slaveholders pride themselves upon being honorable men, but if you were to hear the enormous lies they tell their slaves, you would have small respect for their veracity. I've spoken plain English, pardon me. I cannot use a milder term. When they visit the North and return home, they tell their slaves of the runaways they have seen and describe them to be in the most deplorable condition. A slaveholder once told me that he had seen a runaway friend of mine in New York, and that she besought him to take her back to her master, for she was literally dying of starvation. That many days she had only one cold potato to eat, and at other times could get nothing at all. He said he refused to take her because he knew her master would not thank him for bringing such a miserable wretch to his house. He ended by saying to me, "This is the punishment she brought on herself for running away from a kind master." Brainwashing? This whole story was false. I afterwards stayed with that friend in New York and found her in comfortable circumstances. She had never thought of such a thing as wishing to go back to slavery. Many of the slaves believe such story and think it's not worthwhile to exchange slavery for such a hard kind of freedom. It is difficult to persuade such that freedom could make them useful men and enable them to protect their wives and children. If those heathen in our Christian land had as much teaching as those Hindus, they would think otherwise. They would know that liberty is more valuable than life. They would begin to understand their own capabilities and exert themselves to become men and women. I don't share her view here. They needed freedom. They didn't need her chastisement about learning Christianity because they're already getting a bad version of it. But while free states sustain a law which hurls fugitives back into slavery, how can the slaves resolve to become men? There are some who strive to protect wives and daughters from the insults of their masters, but those who have such sentiments have had advantages above the general mass of slaves. They have been partially civilized and Christianized by favorable circumstances. Some are bold enough to utter such sentiments to their masters. Oh, that there were more of them. So yeah, she's been really socialized into Western values and not at her stage, not knowing the truth that men have been standing up for their wives, partners thing during slavery from they came on the boat, off the boat, even over in Africa. But that's not the only kind of resistance of fighting. Some of the things is staying alive. Some resistance is staying alive. Some poor creatures have been so brutalized by the lash that they will sneak out of the way to give their masters free access to their wives and daughters. Do you think this proves the black man to belong to an inferior order of beings? What would you be if you had been born and brought up a slave with generations of slaves for ancestors? I admit that the black man is inferior. I don't agree with her here, but what is it that makes him so? It is the ignorance in which the white men compel him to live. It is the torturing whip that lashes manhood out of him. It is the fierce bloodhounds of the South and the scarcely less cruel human bloodhounds of the North who enforce the fugitive slave law. They do the work. I think she's trying to say, they would be more men-like in her term of masculinity, if were it not for the circumstances. But even in the circumstances, I don't think they're inferior. Southern gentlemen indulge in the most contemptuous expressions about the Yankees, while they on their part consent to do the vilest work for them, such as the ferocious bloodhounds and the despised Negro hunters are employed to do at home. When Southerners go to the North, they are proud to do them honor, but the Northern man is not welcome south of the Mason-Dixon line, unless he suppresses every thought and feeling at variance with their particular institution, slavery. Nor is it enough to be silent. The masters are not pleased unless they obtain a greater degree of subservience than that, and they're generally accommodated. Do they respect the northerner for this? I trow not. Even the slaves despise a northern man with southern principles, and that is the class they generally see. When northerners go to the south to reside, they prove very apt scholars. They soon imbibe the sentiments and disposition of their neighbors and generally go beyond their teachers. Of the two, they are proverbially the hardest masters. They seem to satisfy their conscience with the doctrine that God created the Africans to be slaves. What a libel upon the Heavenly Father, who made of one blood all nations of men. And who are Africans? Who can measure the amount of Anglo-Saxon blood coursing in the veins of American slaves? I've spoken of the pains slaveholders take to give their slaves a bad opinion of the North, but notwithstanding this, intelligent slaves are aware that they have many friends in the Free States. Even the most ignorant have some confused notion about it. They knew that I could read, and I was often asked if I had seen anything in the newspaper about white people over in the North, in the big North, who were trying to get their freedom for them. Some believe that the abolitionists have already made them free, and that it is established by law, but that their masters prevent the law from going into effect. One woman begged me to get a newspaper and read it over. She said her husband told her that the black people had sent word to the Queen of America that they were all slaves, and that she didn't believe it and went to Washington City to see the president about it. They quarreled. She drew her sword upon him and swore that he should help her to make them all free. That poor ignorant woman thought that America was governed by a queen to whom the president was subordinate. I wish the president was subordinate to Queen of Justice. Yes, that's one way of seeing that story, but there's also that story ignites hope in them. So they kept on knowing that slavery was unjust and dreaming that there was someone who would come to their defense, not knowing that most of the resistance that led to the liberation of the enslaved was done by the enslaved and not a magical queen. They were the kings and queens. There was a planter in the country not far from us, whom I will call Mr. Litch. He was an ill-bred, uneducated man, but very wealthy. He had 600 slaves, many of whom he did not know by sight. His extensive plantation was managed by well-paid overseers. There was a jail and a whipping post on his grounds, and whatever cruelties were perpetrated there, they passed without comment. He was so effectually screened by his great wealth that he was called to no account for his crime, not even for murder. Various were the punishments resorted to. A favorite one was to tie a rope round a man's body and suspend him from the ground. A fire was kindled over him, from which was suspended a piece of fat pork. As this cooked, the scalding drops of fat continually fell on the bare flesh. On his own plantation, he required very strict obedience to the 8th commandment, which is thou shalt not steal, though he was stealing men's labor. But stealing from another neighbor was allowable, provided that the culprit managed to evade detection or suspicion. If a neighbor brought a charge of theft against any of his slaves, he was browbeaten by the master, who assured him that his slave had enough of everything at home and had no inducement to steal. No sooner was the neighbor's back turned than the accused was sought out and whipped for his lack of discretion. So the problem wasn't stealing, it was being caught. If a slave stole from him even a pound of meat or a peck of corn, if detection followed, he was put in chains and imprisoned, and so kept till his form was attenuated by hunger and suffering. How can you steal from a person stealing your labor? A freshet or a flood once bore his wine cellar and meat house miles away from the plantation. Some slaves followed and secured bits of meat and bottles of wine. 2 were detected, a ham and some liquor being found in their huts. They were summoned by their masters. No words were used, but a club felled them to the ground. A rough box was their coffin, and their interment was a dog's burial. Nothing was said. Murder was so common on his plantation that he feared to be alone after nightfall. He might have believed in ghosts. His brother, if not equal in wealth, was at least equal in cruelty. His bloodhounds were well trained. Their pen was spacious and a terror to the slaves. They were let loose on a runaway, and if they tracked him, they literally tore the flesh from his bones. When the slaveholder died, his shrieks and groans were so frightful that they appalled his own friends. His last words were, "I'm going to hell. Bury my money with me." After his death, his eyes remained open. To press the lids down, silver dollars were laid on them. These were buried with him. From this circumstance, a rumor went abroad that his coffin was filled with money. 3 times his grave was opened and his coffin taken out. The last time his body was found on the ground, and a flock of buzzards were pecking at it. He was again interred, and a sentinel set over his grave. The perpetrators were never discovered. Good for them. Cruelty is contagious in an uncivilized community. Mr. Conant, neighbor of Mr. Litch, returned from town one evening in a partial state of intoxication. His body servant gave him some offense. He was divested of his clothes except his shirt, whipped and tied to a large tree in front of the house. It was a stormy night in winter. The wind blew bitterly cold, and the boughs of the old tree crackled on the falling sleet. A member of the family, fearing he would freeze to death, begged that he might be taken down. But the master would not relent. He remained there 3 hours, and when he was cut down, he was more dead than alive. Another slave who stole a pig from this master to appease his hunger was terribly flogged. In desperation, he tried to run away, but at the end of 2 miles, he was so faint with loss of blood, he thought he was dying. He had a wife, and he longed to see her once more. Too sick to walk, he crept back that long distance on his hands and knees. When he reached his master's, it was night. He had not strength to rise and open the gate. He moaned and tried to call for help. I had a friend living in the same family. At last, his cries reached her. She went out and found the prostrate man at the gate. She ran back to the house for assistance, and 2 men returned with her. They carried him in and laid him on the floor. The back of his shirt was one clot of blood. By means of lard, my friend loosened it from the raw flesh. She bandaged him, gave him a cool drink, and left him to rest. The master said he deserved 100 more lashes. When his own labor was stolen from him, he had stolen food to appease his hunger. This was his crime. That was a lot, so take a breath. The cruelty. These are the cruel men that are the exemplars of manhood. Come on now. Thank you so much for listening, and tell me what you think.